The Potter Valley Project has been shaping life in Northern California for more than a century. The pair of dams and the connected diversion tunnel are the reason Lake Pillsbury exists, the reason Sonoma and Mendocino agriculture has thrived, but also one of the reasons that Humboldt's Eel River salmon runs have struggled. And here's the catch, it's scheduled to disappear. PG&E has already filed to decommission it. So what does that mean for water, for farmers, for tribes, and for the environment? To really understand, we need to dig into the project's past and its present, because only then can we see the full picture and the ripple effects that this decision could have on Northern California's future. The Potter Valley Project is made up of two dams on the upper Eel River, the Scott Dam in Lake County, which created Lake Pillsbury, and the Cape Horn Dam in Mendocino County, which diverts water away from the Eel River through a mile-long tunnel into the Potter Valley and Russian River watershed. The Potter Valley Project traces back to around 1900, when the Eel River Power and Irrigation Company, later known as Snow Mountain Water and Power Company, began construction. They built the Cape Horn Dam, the lower portion of the project, which was completed in 1908. This began the diversion of water through a 1-mile tunnel under the ridge into Potter Valley. That water powered turbines as early as April 1908, generating around 4 megawatts with upgrades over the next decade. But the system couldn't run in the dry summer months, which encouraged the construction of the Scott Dam upstream beginning in 1920 and completed in 1922. This created the reservoir that we now know as Lake Pillsbury. With that completed, there was storage for the dry season, and the diversion could run year-round. At the time of construction, most people saw it as a triumph: electricity, water, and a path toward growth. Newspapers celebrated the promise of progress. Farmers welcomed the lifeline that turned Potter Valley and the regions downstream into more productive agricultural lands. Almost nobody was talking about salmon or tribal fishing rights. I should also note that this project was a private venture before the New Deal programs of the early 1930s. However, it did eventually pave way for a public and related project in the creation of Lake Mendocino for better storage and flood control on a lower portion of the Russian River. In 1930, PG&E took over the Potter Valley Project. Back then, it was a modest power operation, but it mattered. PG&E modernized the powerhouse and transmission lines, and at its peak, the project could put out about 9 megawatts of electricity. By today's standards, that's small, but in the 1930s, it was a big deal for the small communities that surrounded it. Then, in 1959, the Army Corps of Engineers built the Coyote Valley Dam downstream, creating the reservoir that we call Lake Mendocino. That reservoir depended in part on water diverted from the Potter Valley Project, which tied Sonoma and Mendocino even more tightly to the Eel River system. But around that same time, people started noticing the trade-offs. Salmon and steelhead runs in the Eel River were collapsing, and by the 1970s and 80s, the project was under scrutiny. When PG&E went through the relicensing process in 1983, federal regulators stepped in and required minimum flows to help protect fish. Then came the 1990s. Salmon and steelhead were listed under the Endangered Species Act, and that meant even stricter limits on how much water could be sent south to the Russian River. On top of that, the economics just weren't adding up anymore. By 2019, PG&E said it outright: the project wasn't worth relicensing. Buying electricity on the open market was cheaper than keeping these old turbines running. By 2021, after a major equipment failure, the powerhouse had effectively shut down. In July of 2025, PG&E officially filed its plan to surrender the license and decommission the project. That means the question isn't if PG&E will leave, but what comes next for the dams, the water, the communities that depend on them, and the struggling endangered species. And that brings us to today, where the debate isn't about power anymore, but about safety, water supply, and the future of two entire river systems. First, there's seismic risk. The Scott Dam sits almost directly on the Bartlett Springs Fault, which is capable of producing powerful earthquakes. PG&E's own engineers have raised concerns, and in recent years, they've lowered the reservoir level at Lake Pillsbury to reduce pressure, a sign that they take this risk seriously. Next, there's the question of how much water actually goes south. On paper, the Potter Valley Project only diverts about 2% of the Eel River's annual flow. But here's the nuance: the Eel is a huge watershed with more than 3,600 square miles, and the project sits way up near the headwaters. That means while the overall percentage looks small, the timing is what really matters. Most of the diversion happens in the summer months, when the river is naturally at its lowest, and that's exactly when juvenile salmon and steelhead are rearing or migrating out. So in those critical months, the project can represent the majority of what little water is left, and that's why it has such an outsized impact on fish. In raw numbers, we're talking around 60,000 acre-feet of water, roughly half of Lake Mendocino's total capacity. That's why farmers, fire agencies, and cities in Sonoma and Mendocino say they can't afford to lose it. At the same time, we have to look at the ecosystem around Lake Pillsbury, which has developed its own following over the past century. One of the most striking examples is the Thule elk herd. These elk were nearly wiped out in California by the late 1800s, and now a small but established population calls the meadows around Lake Pillsbury home. For many people, the elk have become a symbol that this reservoir, even though it's man-made, has created its own habitat worth valuing. Add to that the recreation, the boating, the fishing, the camping, and you'll see that this lake has long been part of how people enjoy the outdoors in this region. But on the flip side, fisheries advocates and tribes point out that every gallon of water stored or diverted south is a gallon that doesn't flow down the Eel. And for salmon and steelhead, which are already hanging by a thread, even a 2% diversion can be devastating. So here's the tension. Do we keep the infrastructure for water security, firefighting, farming, and communities along the Russian River? Or do we remove it to reduce earthquake risk and restore fish runs? And regardless of how straightforward some might make it sound, the truth is that neither answer is simple. So what actually happens next? PG&E filed its official surrender application in July 2025, handing the project to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That kicks off a multi-year process of environmental review and public hearings, likely to stretch into the early 2030s. If nothing else happens, the Potter Valley project is removed. Now let's talk money, because obviously this isn't cheap. PG&E estimates decommissioning the Scott and Cape Horn dams will cost about $532 million. Here's the breakdown of how that gets covered. PG&E has been collecting for these costs over many years from ratepayers. By 2029, they're projected to have around $321 million set aside from the project. That leaves about $211 million, or 40% of the estimated cost that still needs to be covered, most likely by ratepayers. So yes, PG&E is financially responsible for the dismantling under the current terms. There's also talk of a replacement facility called the New Eel Russian Facility, which would restore some seasonal diversion. That's estimated at around $50 million, though that number may increase as engineering progresses. It would be funded by a mix of grants and contributions from water agencies and local beneficiaries. But critics warn that once you stack on infrastructure and restoration, the total regional tab could exceed $2 billion. And that cost will fall on a mix of ratepayers, water users, agencies, and possibly taxpayers. So the bottom line is that PG&E has set aside some funds to decommission, but the rest, and especially anything related to the replacement system, will come from partnerships and potentially everyday water users. That's why local agencies, tribes, and water districts are already talking through cost sharing and funding strategies. The dams are on track to come down. It's whether we replace them or not, and who pays. Now, if you're asking, are our water rates already going up because of this? The short answer is not explicitly for now. Sonoma Water has approved rate increases for 2025 and 2026, typically between $0 and $3 a month, depending on where you live. And though not expressly linked to the Potter Valley project decommissioning, the increase is to fund vital infrastructure, hazard mitigation, and salmon protection efforts required by state and federal regulators. Sonoma Water is already eager to invest in storage, aquifers, and infrastructure that can keep water flowing even as the system evolves. And on top of all of this, regional economic studies show that losing even 10% of current diversion water could cost the Sonoma County economy about $67 million a year in lost output. So while there isn't a direct Potter Valley surcharge yet, the ripple effects are already showing in the systems that support water stability for us all. On the other side of this debate is the question of what happens if the Eel River is restored. Now, even if both the Scott and Cape Horn dams are removed, it's not like the Eel River instantly springs back to life. For more than a century, Lake Pillsbury has trapped sediment and altered flows. Removing the dams would release that sediment downstream, rebuild gravel beds, and restore a more natural flow. But those changes ideally unfold gradually. Salmon and steelhead populations could take decades to rebound, especially with climate change adding pressure. What dam removal really does is shift the trajectory. Instead of continued decline, the eel gets a chance at long-term recovery. Meanwhile, communities on the Russian River would feel the impacts immediately, unless a replacement diversion system is built. When looking at dam removal projects, the closest comparison we have is the Klamath River in southern Oregon and northern California. In 2024, the largest dam removal project in US history was completed there. 4 major hydroelectric dams came out, reopening over 400 miles of salmon and steelhead habitat. Tribal nations spearheaded the push, later joined by states and environmental groups, and now the river is flowing freely for the first time in a century. The Klamath is a larger, steadier system than the Eel, draining over 15,000 square miles compared to the Eel's 3,600. But the principle is the same. When you take out barriers, fish have the ability to come back, ecosystems have the ability to recover, and cultural ties to the river are restored. For the Eel River, removing the Scott Dam would reopen more than 280 miles of historic habitat. And while the eel is smaller and much more variable, raging in the winter, trickling in the summer, that habitat is incredibly important. Every mile of cold, shaded stream matters for salmon and steelhead. And it's not just about the fish. For tribes along the Eel, restoration is a matter of cultural survival. For fishing communities on the North Coast, more salmon in the river means more salmon in the ocean, and that supports commercial and recreational fisheries alike. Healthy rivers also mean healthier forests, more stable banks, and more resilient ecosystems for wildlife. So even if the eel's restoration wouldn't be as large in scale as the Klamath, it would still be transformative. For the river itself, for the people who live along it, and for anyone downstream who depends on salmon and steelhead. And at the end of the day, the Potter Valley project isn't just about dams and diversion. It's about people. ecosystems, and the future we want for Northern California. On one hand, it's completely understandable that communities in Mendocino and Sonoma counties want reliable, sustainable water infrastructure. Farmers, fire agencies, and entire towns have built their lives around it for more than a century. On the other hand, it's just as understandable that tribes, environmental groups, and coastal communities want to see the Eel River restored to health. Not just for the salmon and steelhead, but for cultural survival, ecosystem balance, and economic resilience tied to the fisheries. And that's the real point. This isn't a simple yes or no issue. It's one of the most complex water decisions our drought-prone region has faced in generations. Whatever path we choose, it will reshape life along both the Eel and Russian rivers for decades to come. So this is something we should all be paying attention to, and something worth getting involved in. Whether you live in Humboldt, Mendocino, Sonoma, Marin, Lake County, or beyond, this story touches you. Because in the end, it's not about choosing water or fish, farms or tribe. It's about finding a balance that sustains us all. Send this to someone who should know what's happening here, and let me know what you think down in the comments. I want to hear your perspective. And yes, I am a realtor, but I'm also a concerned community member who tries to see these issues from all sides and provide fair insight into how they affect our future. So whether you're a lifelong local looking for your next home, you're wondering if the North Bay is the right place for you, or you just want to stay on top of what's happening in the communities we all live in, make sure to follow along, subscribe, and get involved in the comments. This conversation matters, and your voice is a part of it.